On August 25th, 1835, the first in a series of shocking essays was published in the New York Sun. The front page read, "Great Astronomical Discoveries lately made by Sir John Herschel." Sir John Herschel was a leading astronomer, as well as a chemist, mathematician, photographer, and he also invented the blueprint. So he was already well known in scientific circles. Just the year before, he had traveled to Cape Town, and he was undergoing this multi-year survey of the skies of the southern hemisphere. But according to the article in The Sun, his discoveries proved to be far more dramatic than distant suns or new planets. The articles, written by a Dr. Richard Grant, were reprinted from the Edinburgh Journal of Science. Dr. Grant wrote that Herschel had built a telescope that was 6 times larger than those currently available. And through a telescope that measured 24 feet in diameter, he was able to see the surface of the moon with greater clarity than anyone else before. The moon was not desolate, but bursting with life. Lush vegetation, valleys, rivers, a variety of animals that looked eerily similar to our own. Most shocking of all were the race of human-like creatures who stood 4 feet tall and flew on bat wings. The articles were sensational, convincing thousands of readers, including some academics and journalists. But there were 2 problems. The Edinburgh Journal of Science had been out of print since 1833, and Dr. Richard Grant didn't exist. Today, we are exploring the story of the Great Moon Hoax of 1835. I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. Today is an Earl Grey kind of day. It's actually disgusting outside. This is not my first time discussing a famous hoax on the show. Back in January, I shared an episode about the Cottingley fairies. And as I was researching for the Great Moon Hoax, I found myself thinking a lot about the Cottingley photographs and how the broader cultural circumstances around that event helped to fuel belief. We're going to see a similar pattern with the Great Moon Hoax, which was reprinted in newspapers across the US and Europe. But unlike the Cottingley fairies, the author in this case wasn't trying to trick people. The articles were actually intended to be works of satire. And today, we are going to learn exactly how it got so out of control. First, the New York Sun should not be confused with the British tabloid The Sun. Those are 2 different papers. Although it is funny because you could totally imagine The Sun printing something like this. Founded by Benjamin Day in 1833, the New York Sun was the first in a new type of publication known as the penny press. Daily newspapers that sold only for the price of a penny with mass market appeal. Think human interest pieces, local news, especially relating to crime, and sensational stories. By the way, if you're a fan of Terry Pratchett's Discworld, his novel The Truth satirizes this exact moment in history. This new kind of daily was made possible thanks to the invention of steam-powered printing presses, developed by Friedrich Koenig in the 1810s. Crucially, these new presses could churn out tens of thousands of copies per day. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the flow of information by the early 19th century. A much greater share of the public could now read. And this wider audience demanded affordable reading material, which included not just books, but now magazines, penny dreadfuls, and cheap daily newspapers. This led to competition between the traditional 6-cent newspapers, which had a more upper-class, formerly educated audience, and the new penny papers, which catered to the working class. To use a modern example, think the New York Times versus the New York Post. The New York Sun was also the first employer of newsboys. If you're familiar with that musical Newsies, this is what it's about. These were young boys who were hired to sell papers on the street while shouting out the latest headlines. The more sensational, the better. So as this relates to the Great Moon Hoax, we can see that we already have the makings of a mass media event. But with industrialization and widening literacy, we also have the explosion of popular science. Now, for the first time, you didn't have to be a learned gentleman or an academic to learn about cutting-edge research. News of advancements in medicine, news of daring expeditions around the globe, and discoveries that would radically reshape our understanding of the world were now accessible to a much larger portion of the public. Astronomy was no exception to this, and increasingly people began to wonder if humans really were alone in the universe, or could there be intelligent life on other planets? However, the growth of popular science also led to many dubious, unproven claims. One example was the Reverend Thomas Dick, an Anglican minister and a hugely successful popular science writer who argued passionately that science and religion didn't need to be diametrically opposed. But the Reverend also promoted ideas that were patently false. He believed that every planet in our solar system was inhabited, and he created population estimates for Mars, Venus, and all the rest based on the human population of England and adjusting for each planet's surface area. One of the writers of the New York Sun, a man named Richard Adams Locke, detested the work of Thomas Dick and decided that the concept of life on the moon would be a very appropriate satire. He wasn't the first to satirize some of the more ridiculous aspects of popular science. Edgar Allan Poe published a satirical short story in the Southern Literary Messenger called The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, about an adventurer's voyage to the moon. His story, now considered a pioneering work of the science fiction genre, came out 2 months before Locke's. And Poe was very disgruntled that Locke's work proved more successful. He actually accused Locke of plagiarism. But while readers could easily tell that Poe's short story was a work of satire, Locke's version was initially more convincing. Dr. Richard Grant, of course, was a made-up character, but Sir John Herschel was very much a real person. It is true that in 1834, Herschel traveled to Cape Town to begin his astronomical survey, a project that lasted for 4 years. And it's true that Herschel made many groundbreaking discoveries during that time. The Edinburgh Journal of Science was, as I mentioned earlier, also a real journal, which only stopped printing in 1833, but American readers were largely unaware of that. Locke's article was also written in a less humorous, more journalistic style with convincing technical details. Additionally, the New York Sun already had thousands of readers in comparison to the smaller Southern Literary Messenger, so it was more poised to make waves. A similar event occurred in 1938 when Orson Welles directed a CBS adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which told the story of a Martian invasion in a hyper-realistic format for the medium, causing some panic among listeners who thought that the story was real. The Great Moon Hoax, of course, did not inspire panic, but it did inspire curiosity and fascination. To what extent did people believe it? Contemporary accounts suggest that belief among the public was widespread. Asa Green, editor of the New York Transcript, wrote in 1837, "The credulity was general. All New York rang with the wonderful discoveries of Sir John Herschel. There were indeed a few skeptics, but to venture to express a doubt of the genuineness of the great lunar discoveries was considered almost as heinous a sin as to question the truth of revelation." Edgar Allan Poe, with great annoyance, also noted that most of the people he encountered believed in the hoax. Years later, in the 1850s, the Southern Quarterly Review described the overwhelming excitement on Yale's campus regarding the discovery of life on the moon. But were these accounts maybe biased? Were they inflating the number of believers? It's possible, because newspapers were actually split. The New York Herald, which was the Sun's biggest competitor, loudly claimed that these reports were fraudulent. Other skeptics included the Transcript, the New York Evening Post, the New York Sunday News, and more. Some publications, like The New Yorker, shared, let's say, lukewarm belief. But as the story spread beyond New York City, more papers, like the Boston Globe, described it as a hoax. As I mentioned earlier, tricking people was not Locke's original intention, though in some ways the public's overwhelming response seemed to bolster his critique of popular science. It was a work of satire that proved to be a bit too effective, and a few years later, Locke would come forward and say that the articles were fiction. But the impact of the Great Moon Hoax can still be felt today. The triumph of the penny press, the demonstration of the public's appetite for sensational stories and headlines would endure, leading to the growth of a tabloid market that would peak in the 1990s and the early 2000s. The New York Sun, as other writers have noted, didn't receive much criticism from other newspapers, with the exception of the New York Herald. It was almost as if they were taking notes. And what about the real John Herschel? The scientist took the whole thing in great stride, describing the incident as an innocent amusement. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to learn more about folklore and weird history, please make sure that you're subscribed, and maybe even share it with a friend or two. Be well, and I'll see you next time.